compound movement can also be referred to as a multi-joint exercise. An isolation movement is an exercise that causes stimulus to one specific targeted muscle group. So that being said, that's the end of the video, right? Wrong.
And I hope you let me in, yeah.
What is going on, guys, and welcome to the Disrupt the Industry podcast. I'm your host, Dre Canavati, and today we are on some kind of episode. I don't know what number it is, but we're on the next episode of Starting from Scratch. And this episode, we are going to be discussing compound movements versus isolation movements. Now, the premise is Starting from Scratch. If you have not been here, or this is your first time watching the video, basically take an avatar or a person who has never been in the gym one time in their life, and they're literally starting from scratch. They have absolutely no prior knowledge of anything when it comes to health, fitness, nutrition, lifting, hypertrophy, bodybuilding, anything. This is the series that's going to help them to learn. And like I said, today we're going to be talking about compound movements versus isolation movements. So let's talk about compound movements right off the bat. So a compound movement can also be referred to as a multi-joint exercise, right? But again, I'm just going to call it a compound movement. So compound movement, multi-joint exercise, same thing. So again, all a compound movement is going to be an exercise that works multiple muscle groups. For example, a inclined barbell bench press works your chest, your front delts, and your triceps, okay? Now, we also have isolation movements. And isolation movements, right, can also be referred to as single joint movements. So an isolation movement is an exercise that, again, causes stimulus to one specific targeted muscle group, right? So for example, if you're doing a cable chest fly, you're going to be working your chest, or isolation movement, your chest as you're doing that single joint exercise, right? So that being said, that's the end of the video, right? Wrong. Let's talk about the differences between each, why one is better than the other, why you need both, right? And how it all goes together into programming, and why one cannot be existent without the other when it comes to hypertrophy and strength programming. Now, first and foremost, we have to talk about compound movements versus isolation movements in conjunction with the stimulus to fatigue ratio. Now, that was a lot of words. The next video we're going to do is going to be on the stimulus to fatigue ratio, right? But all I want to explain to you in the simplest terms is the stimulus to fatigue ratio. Is each exercise produces a certain amount of stimulus to your muscles, and each exercise produces a certain amount of fatigue to your central nervous system, right? So stimulus and fatigue for each and every exercise. So normally, and this is a generalization right here, right? Because obviously there are levels to this. Normally, a compound movement is going to generate a high amount of stimulus, but also a high amount of fatigue, or a higher amount of fatigue. And generally, right, or normally, an isolation movement is going to provide a high amount of stimulus, but have a lower amount of fatigue, right? Now, obviously, in primal terms, stimulus, good. High stimulus, good. High fatigue, bad. We want low fatigue, right? So that does beg the question, why, as hypertrophy athletes or bodybuilders or athletes who train for hypertrophy, why do we even do compound movements if they generate a high amount of fatigue, right? Why do we even do that? Why don't we just do all isolation movements, which again would give us a ton of stimulus, right? But a lower amount of fatigue. So that way we can keep progressing. First and foremost is going to be programming efficiency. So like we talked about before, if you're coming in and you're doing a push day, right? Which is chest, shoulders, and triceps. So that's going to be every head of your tricep, every head of your or not every head, your front delt and side delt, and then your chest, your upper chest, lower chest, mid chest, all that great stuff, right? You don't want to come into the gym and do 5 chest isolation movements, right? You don't want to do, after that, you're going to be exhausted, 5 shoulder or delt isolation movements, and then say you don't want to do 5 tricep isolation movements. No, programming efficiency, right? Let's use the same example as before. An inclined barbell bench press is going to induce stimulus in our chest, our front delts, and our triceps. So again, when it comes to programming efficiency, right? Instead of doing 5 separate chest isolations and 5 separate shoulder isolations and 5 separate tricep isolations, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to program isolation movements into your program so that you can cut your training time in half and you can have a more efficient workout or have more efficient programming. Very easy, very simple. Next, and this is going to be another point in favor of compound movements, is loading potential. Generally, you're going to have an easier time getting stronger and adding weight on compound movements rather than isolation movements, right? Now, here's the best example ever. Barbell deadlift, right? It's going to be a lot easier to add 20 pounds to your barbell deadlift as opposed to 20 pounds on your dumbbell curls. Let's put that in perspective. Your barbell deadlift, if you add 20 pounds, you're going from 315 to 335. That's definitely possible, and it's definitely doable when it comes to a barbell deadlift, a big compound movement like a barbell deadlift. But how are you going to add 20 pounds to an alternating dumbbell curl? So you're at the 30-pound dumbbells and you're curling them, and then the next week you come in and you try the 50s. That's going to be a lot harder. So again, you have easier loading potential when it comes to compound movements versus isolation movements. It's easier to increase load, which, as we know from our previous modules, is going to be increasing mechanical tension, right? Which is the main driver in hypertrophy. Mechanical tension being getting stronger, normally referred to as getting stronger under a heavier load and creating more or a greater muscle tension. So once again, spit out a lot of words at you there. Compound movements are going to be better for achieving that mechanical tension and progressing and hitting progressive overload than isolation movements. Again, it's going to be really hard to add. I'm going to use the same example as before. It's going to be a lot harder to add 20 pounds to your curl going from curling the 30-pound dumbbells to the 50-pound dumbbells, or going from the 50-pound dumbbells to the 70-pound dumbbells. A 70-pound dumbbell curl is really, really impressive, guys, and it's going to be a lot different as opposed to it's going to be progressing on a squat or a Smith machine bench press, something along the lines of that. Now, again, this one's going to be more in favor of an isolation movement. So let's talk about it. So stimulus accuracy. Now, you're probably like, Dre, what the heck is stimulus accuracy? Well, I'm going to explain it to you. So say you're on a flat barbell bench press, right? And you start to hit failure or achieve failure within your set as you're performing that flat barbell bench press. You really can't tell unless you're a super, super, super advanced lifter if it's your chest failing out, if it's your triceps failing out, or if it's your front delts or shoulders failing out when it comes to which body part is actually the limiting factor when it comes to failing within your set, right? So again, it's going to be a lot harder to be able to determine, hey, I'm trying to do this bench press to grow my chest, but it's my triceps that keep failing out, or it's my chest that keeps failing out, or oh my gosh, my chest and triceps failed out, so I'm lifting my butt off the bench, and then that's a whole other thing, right? We don't want that, right? Again, so it's going to be a little more difficult to determine that stimulus accuracy. The same, just another example that I heard John Jewett talk about was the barbell back squat. Right? You're failing a barbell back squat. What is actually failing as you're failing that rep? Is it your quads are failing out, or your lower back's failing out, or is it your glutes or erectors failing out? That was a great example that I heard from John Jewett, and that is an amazing example that he provided. You know, when you actually fail that barbell squat, what's actually failing? For a lot of beginners, it's not really going to be the quads that's failing. It's going to be a lot of core stabilization, maybe some lower back, some erectors, things like that, in my humble opinion, from doing hypertrophy training and bodybuilding for over 7 years now. So on the flip side, when you're failing out on an isolation movement, or we're going to take the cable chest fly, for example, when you're failing out on a cable chest fly, it's definitely going to be your chest that's failing out. Your chest is definitely going to be the limiting factor of the muscle that's failing on that cable chest fly. Why? Because it's an isolation movement, and you know that, hey, I'm failing. It's not your triceps failing. It's not your biceps or your front delts failing. It's your chest. My chest is actually failing out. Same thing with a barbell curl, or a bicep curl, I should say, or a dumbbell curl. When you do a dumbbell curl, you're like, oh, this is my bicep working. Like, you definitely know that, hey, my bicep is going to fail out here as I'm doing this repetition. It's not as much your front delt failing out. It's not as much your back failing out. It's, oh my gosh, my bicep is failing out. So again, very easy and very simple example right there. Now let's talk about learning periods, right? This is the final thing that's going to actually favor isolation movements as well. So many people think they can hypertrophy train and just get on the bench and start bench pressing. And that's definitely what I thought I could do when I first started lifting, and that is just the furthest thing from the truth. You should not just get on that bench and start bench pressing, believe it or not. Do you learn by doing? Yes. Kinesthetic learning, in my opinion, is the best way to learn how to do something. But that being said, let's just take the barbell close grip bench press, for example. That is a skill-based movement. You don't just start pressing that barbell up and down. Like, there is bar path, there's light drive, there's tightness, there's bracing. There are so many different aspects that you have to learn when it comes to learning how to do a compound movement properly, right? And it takes time. It takes time to learn the skill of doing that compound movement. Whereas isolation movements, and let me actually put a side note here, right? As a coach, when I have my clients send me form videos, clients always just mess up the isolation movements just as much as the compound movements. So I cannot express that enough. My clients really do mess up on isolation movements just as much as compound movements. However, it's a lot easier to fix error on those isolation movements as compared to those compound movements. So those are just some pros and some cons of what's going to be compound movements versus isolation movements. And if you want me to list them once more, I can do it in a very summed up manner. Compound movement pros are going to be loading potential, meaning you're going to be able to load the movement heavier and do more weight. And then program efficiency, meaning your workouts are going to be more efficient in the terms that you don't have to do, like we said before, 5 chest, 5 shoulder, 5 tricep exercises per muscle group during a workout, but you can actually throw that compound movement in there, and what will happen is that compound movement will train each of those muscle groups, chest, shoulders, and triceps. Say flat dumbbell bench press. That will train your chest, your shoulders, and your triceps. Now, will it train your chest and tris possibly more than your front delts? Yeah, it definitely will. But again, each of those muscle groups are getting touched with a certain amount of stimulus, right? So you're not going to have to do 5 to 6 to 7 isolation movements per exercise. It's going to make the efficiency of your programming a lot better because you're going to be in the gym for a lot less or a lot shorter period of time. Compound movement cons is a poor stimulus accuracy, meaning, again, taking the example of the barbell bench press, you don't know if your chest is failing out. You don't know if your triceps are failing out. You don't know if your shoulders are failing out when you're failing that movement. So as opposed to an isolation movement where, again, if you're doing that tricep extension, you know for a fact when you start to fail, it's your tricep failing out. So the accuracy of the stimulus is going to be greater and easier to achieve with an isolation movement. And then another con of a compound movement is going to be compound movements are almost always going to generate a lot higher fatigue or a greater amount of systemic fatigue than an isolation movement. It's just common sense. You're going to get a lot more fatigue from doing a heavy barbell deadlift rather than doing, say, a dumbbell curl. It's just common sense. And then, like we talked about a couple minutes ago, it's going to take a longer learning curve. It's going to take you a little bit longer to perfect a barbell deadlift rather than a tricep extension on a cable, right? It's just common sense, a couple tweaks and you got that tricep extension. But when it comes to a barbell deadlift, what's going to happen is that may take 2 to 3 to 4 weeks. And even then, advanced lifters are always perfecting their form and revising their form when it comes to movements like a barbell deadlift. You're almost never going to get it perfect. That's actually not true. You can get it perfect in a sense, but there's always going to be ways that you can improve upon doing those movements. Isolation movements, pros and cons. Isolation movement pro number 1 is going to be a higher stimulus accuracy for isolation movements. So again, if you're doing a quad extension or if you're doing a hamstring curl, you're going to definitely feel that quad extension in your quads. You're definitely going to feel that hamstring curl in your hamstrings, right? Say you do a dumbbell front raise, you're definitely going to feel that dumbbell front raise in your front delts. Or again, the example of you do a dumbbell curl, you're definitely going to feel that curl in your biceps. So again, higher stimulus accuracy is going to be huge when it comes to hypertrophy training with isolation movements. Another huge pro is going to be you're going to generate a lot less fatigue or systemic fatigue doing isolation movements. Again, just throwing this out there, a cable tricep pushdown is going to generate a lot less fatigue than a heavy barbell bench press. Common sense, easy peasy. And then last but not least, there's a shorter learning curve, meaning it's going to take a lot less time, in my humble opinion, to learn how to do something like a tricep extension on a rope cable, just pushing down, rather than learning how to perfect a barbell squat, a barbell bench, or a barbell deadlift. It's just going to take more time to master those more complicated free weighted compound movements. The first con of isolation movements is less loading potential. Again, you're going to be able to go much, much heavier on an incline Smith machine chest press as opposed to a tricep push down or a cable chest fly or a dumbbell side lateral raise. Again, just a common sense thing. You're going to be able to go a lot heavier on your compound movements versus your isolation movements, which again, the isolation movements, to bring it all together, is going to provide less loading potential than a compound movement, meaning you're going to have to go lighter on a isolation movement, resulting in a little bit less of a hypertrophic stimulus when it comes to mechanical tension or actually just adding weight to that barbell, dumbbell, machine, cable, etc. And then, of course, like we talked about before, the final con of an isolation movement would be just lower program efficiency. No one wants to walk into the gym and do 5 to 6 exercises for chest, all isolation movements, and then move on. You're probably going to be exhausted. 5 to 7 isolation movements for shoulders, and then 5 to 7 isolation movements for triceps. If you're doing all isolation movements within your workout, it's just not fun. It's just not worth it. And you're going to be missing out on a lot of that stimulus, that higher stimulus, right? And that higher loading potential and the higher ability to hit progressive overload with mechanical tension from your your compound movements. You're going to be missing out on those compound movements and that great stimulus from the compound movements. Now, we're finished. We're veering into the end of the video here, guys, and I do want to talk about compound movement examples versus isolation movement examples, and I think this is so important. When people hear compound movements, I even hear people who claim to be coaches talk about stuff like this. They're like, yeah, I don't do any compounds. They're like, I don't do any compounds, and they're talking about squat, bench, and deadlift, right? Barbell squat, barbell bench, barbell deadlift, and they're like, I don't do compounds. And it's like, that doesn't even make any sense. Do you mean you don't do free weighted barbell movements? Because a compound movement, as we know, is an exercise that works multiple muscle groups simultaneously. So again, a compound movement is not just your barbell squat, your barbell bench, your barbell deadlift, your barbell row. No, it's your plate loaded incline Smith machine chest press, right? It's your Smith machine bent over row. It can be your close grip bench press. It can be your machine shoulder press, right? A compound movement is not just with a barbell. It can be with a Smith machine. It can be with a plate loaded machine. It can be with a pin loaded machine, guys. Okay. That is the definition of your compound movement, is a muscle group, or not a muscle group, an exercise that works multiple muscle groups. So just 4 more examples. It could be a incline dumbbell bench press, flat barbell bench press. It could be a plate loaded rowing machine. It could be a pin loaded shoulder press machine. Those are all examples of compound movements. And then when it comes to isolation movements, you can do dumbbell side lateral raises. I'll just do every muscle group, right? So upper chest or chest, right? We can do cable chest flies. That's a great isolation movement for the chest. Dumbbell side lateral raises for the side delts. Dumbbell front raises for the front delts. Rear delt pec deck fly for your rear delts. You can do bicep curls, dumbbell curls, right? Alternating dumbbell curls for your biceps. You can do a lat pullover for your lats. You can do quad extensions for your quads, hamstring curls for your hamstrings, glute kickbacks for your glutes, calf raises for your calves. A bunch of different isolation movements for every single muscle group, right? So again, those are all single joint movements that are going to isolate that muscle group, aka an isolation movement. But guys, I know that was complicated, I know that was wordy, but that's the difference between compound movements and isolation movements, and the pros and cons of each, and why you cannot have one without the other, right? It's like you can't have light without dark, you can't have good without evil, you can't have compound movements without isolation movements, and you can't have isolation movements without compound movements when it comes to the world of bodybuilding and hypertrophy. But thank you guys so much. God bless you. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. If you learned something, please drop a like. Please comment the most helpful tip that you learned, and please subscribe to the channel. It would mean so much. You guys, I can't tell you, when I was less mature, I would say, how many YouTube videos I would watch and they would be like, please subscribe, and I never would. And now I go back and I subscribe to everybody because it just helps so much, and people do not realize. So please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much. God bless you, and let's disrupt the industry.
Yeah.